and I would like to introduce Natalie Ross, who is the Senior Director for Global Philanthropy and Partnerships at the Council of Foundations. And Natalie will share her experiences of how she's working with philanthropy in the United States and promoting the SDGs among the foundations there, and trying to also encourage more collaboration and interest from these foundations with other countries. But before I give the floor to Natalie, I wanted to say that SDG Philanthropy Platform is a partnership initiative between UNDP, the RPA, Rockefeller Philanthropy Advisors, and the Foundation Center. And it aims to foster more collaboration and partnerships between governments, the United Nations, and philanthropy in implementing the Sustainable Development Goals. We are present currently in 7 countries, including the United States, but also Kenya, Ghana, Zambia, Indonesia, Colombia, and India recently. We soon will be in Brazil, and I'm very pleased to see Luciana joining the seminar. And in the countries, we are fostering the relationships between local philanthropy as well as global philanthropy and local players, governments, private sector, social investors, to really make them connected and collaborate on achieving the Sustainable Development Goals. We are also very present at the global conversation, both at the UN level as well as with the global foundations. And we are very happy to see that philanthropy is really picking up and being more and more interested in the Sustainable Development Goals. And Natalie will tell us a little bit more of why American philanthropy is specifically interested in the SDGs and what are the kind of specific entry points that she found that resonate and got tractions in the United States. So please, everyone, go and check the sdgfounders.org, which is our website where we have all the information about our activities. You can also engage in the conversation on the social media, and you will see what we do and how we do it. But in the meantime, I give the floor to Natalie, who will tell us a little bit more of the U.S. And working with philanthropy. And finally, I say that the United States is the only rich country that joined philanthropy, that joined the SDG Philanthropy Platform so far, so that it's very encouraging to see that actually SDGs are truly universal. Natalie, over to you.
Great. Thank you so much, Carolina. So my name is Natalie Ross. I'm the Senior Director for Global Philanthropy and Partnerships here at the Council on Foundations. And so I think it's telling me that the poll needs to be closed to enable screen sharing. So as soon as we do that, I will go ahead. Great. So hopefully you can see my slides. Who is the Council on Foundations? What I'll do is talk a little bit about who we are, what we're seeing broadly around the SDG implementation in the United States, and then talking about how philanthropy has been a part of that conversation and how we're focusing on bringing philanthropy to the table for domestic implementation of the SDGs, although we know that U.S. philanthropy also funds implementation of the SDGs globally. So I'll talk a little bit about that as well. So the Council on Foundations, we're almost 70 years old. We're a nonprofit association of grant makers here in the United States. The majority of our members are American foundations, although we have a small number of non-American funders. As part of our network, we currently represent more than 1,000 foundations, and we work to amplify, strengthen, and advocate for philanthropy in the United States and around the world. So I think when we started to think about the SDGs and as they were being developed in 2014 and getting close to adoption, we understood the importance of the universality of the agenda. But one of the first questions that was asked by our network and by others thinking about whether the SDGs would have resonance in the U.S. was whether they're relevant, whether the goals kind of make sense locally or domestically in the United States. So we truly believe that they do. And so I'm going to start with a little bit of highlighting about where things are in the U.S. at a national and a subnational level to show the relevance of the SDGs, and then talk about what's happening around implementation. So around poverty, the U.S. Ranks 30th out of 34 OECD countries around poverty rate. At a national level, it's about 17.4%. We also are highest in the OECD of obesity. And our rate alone is triple the rate of the top 5 countries. And around clean energy, we also are close to the bottom around emission of carbon dioxide per capita. None of that is surprising. These 3 goals are particularly relevant in a high-income country like the United States. The Sustainable Development Solutions Network released their SDG index in 2016, and it ranks the U.S. 25th globally out of 149 countries. And you'll see that we are doing well on only 2 goals, clean water and sanitation, and infrastructure. And even around water, goal 6, at the same time we have a lot of news coming out over the last 2 years about the situation with lead poisoning in water in Flint, Michigan, and other urban centers in the U.S. So even though we may achieve SDG targets, obviously across the framework, all 17 goals are relevant in the U.S. And are areas where we need to improve as a country domestically. I think for us, as we talk about what philanthropy can do on the SDGs, we very quickly look at subnational levels. And in the United States, just like in other countries, you have national statistics, but then very different statistics at a subnational level. So if we look at goal 1, one of our groups foundations is working in the state of Arkansas, which is in the south of the United States. It's a relatively poor state, and it's 4th in poverty level. So its poverty is almost 20% of the state. So if they're going to cut poverty in half, they're going to need to move over 275,000 people out of poverty in that state by 2030. Similarly, I think in the U.S. there's a huge focus and need to look at inequality. It's one of the goals where we do particularly weak. So this is an example of a study by one of our members, the Robert Wood Johnson Foundation, looking at Minneapolis and St. Paul in Minnesota, another place where we're bringing philanthropy together. And this highlights the significant inequality. So in this small geographic area of just looking at the city of Minneapolis, you can be born or live 3 miles away from each other and have a 13-year lifespan difference. And so obviously inequality is a huge problem in the United States. This is another graph from Minnesota, from our event there, looking at the health goals and looking at low birth rate and showing the disparity across ethnic groups, but also racial groups. And what's interesting about this is that it's not a racial disparity. It's not that Black children are more likely to be born at low weight. It's actually Black children born in the United States versus Black children born outside of the United States or to mothers who are non-American, showing that in some ways it's very much about socioeconomic status and less about race, and that's something we need to really look at in the United States when we think about inequality. And obviously the SDGs are very relevant in our country and the challenges that we face domestically. So at a federal level, President Obama was a huge supporter of the SDGs. At the council, we've worked closely with the U.S. representatives to the process to develop the goals. And in many ways, the SDGs reflected many American values. I think especially Goal 16 and the focus around justice and access to justice. It was something that the U.S. delegation was very passionate about including, and has been something that's already taken off here in the U.S., looking both domestically and globally. So during the Obama's last 2 years, the White House promoted both domestic and international implementation of the goals, and they did a number of things to achieve that out of the White House, including co-convening the National Security Council, which looks at international issues, and the Domestic Policy Council, which looks at domestic issues, and bringing them together for regular interagency convenings to talk about how the government was working to achieve the SDGs. And this is really the first time those two bodies had come together around a shared framework. So it was really monumental for the U.S. And what it led to was a number of different initiatives that looked at domestic implementation. Of course, there was leadership from Department of State and USAID, but there weren't from others. And so we saw, for example, that the U.S. Department of Agriculture worked with a collection of civil society partners, including foundations like the Rockefeller Foundation, to launch at the adoption of the goals in September 2015, a domestic movement around food waste, which is part of Goal 12. And committing to cutting food waste in half in the United States. And post-Obama, that initiative has rolled out of the government and is now housed and led by the Rockefeller Foundation with partnership from charities working on hunger and food in the United States. And so it continues to be a public-private partnership around Goal 12, very focused on domestic implementation. For Goal 16, from the beginning, there was an initiative and a presidential memorandum around access to justice and the need for the U.S. to think about Goal 16 in a domestic sense as soon as the goals were adopted. So the Department of Justice at a national level has worked over the last 2 years very closely with a coalition of civil society partners and foundations like the Open Society Foundation here in the U.S. to develop national indicators that would be relevant to measure increases in access to justice by Americans. This is particularly timely if we think about the challenges that the U.S. broadly is facing around relationships between police and different ethnic groups, especially in urban centers. And so this initiative has been fully linked to Goal 16 since the very beginning and has been moving forward to develop those national indicators. So what's interesting about both of these examples is that there were political appointees, which are staff who changed with the new president, but also career civil servants who were working on these initiatives. And so in both cases, there are existing career staff who are still working under a Trump administration in these agencies who are deeply committed to continuing work to achieve the SDGs. So we'll talk a bit later at the end when we look at what's next about the kind of changing support at a national level under a Trump administration. But the key here is that there is a support from career staff who are staying through the new administration to continue work on these issues in partnership with both philanthropy, civil society, and the private sector. One of the other things that was a huge priority of the Obama administration, which was launched shortly before Trump's inauguration, was a national dashboard around how the U.S. is achieving the SDGs domestically. The site is sdg.data.gov. It is still live, and we're trying not to promote it, and no one's trying to promote it too publicly in case it were to get attention drawn towards it and some data taken off. But the goal is for this to track work towards the SDGs nationally from now till 2030. If you click a goal within it, you can see what the U.S. government through our Office of Management and Budget has decided is the metric to measure that goal at a national level, and it will show you change over time with that statistic. So it was a very cross-governmental attempt to understand where they can measure different indicators and targets. And so this is a really exciting site that got launched before the transition, and that is being managed by career staff in our chief statistician's office at a national level. The U.S. is also working nationally to promote dashboards like this to other countries, and the chief statistician has been very involved in that to try and get others to also measure national achievement and implementation of the SDGs. So that's the work at a national level, looking at government's involvement. We also have leadership at city levels in a couple different ways in the U.S. So one is the number of mayors who've committed to the SDGs, led by Bill de Blasio in New York City, but with a number of other mayors also committed domestically. And in the US, there's also a series of city pilots led by Jeff Stacks and his team at the Sustainable Development Solutions Network that are implementing the SDGs at a city level. So being in Washington, we're very close to the pilot in Baltimore, which has done some really interesting work, but there's also other pilots in San Jose and links with the work in New York City. So for one example of how a city is using the SDGs, this is what's called the One NYC plan that was launched in 2015 by Mayor de Blasio in New York. To the city, there's 4 visions for a different New York by 2030: a growing, thriving city, a just and equitable city, a sustainable city, and a resilient city. But the Office of Global Partnerships in the mayor's office, when they created those 4 visions, if you will, from the very beginning, linked those to the SDGs. And they have a great document that shows and talks in more detail about how those are linked when they launched this city version of One NYC. So it's interesting, and this links to some of the things we've learned about foundations. It's not promoting the SDGs explicitly. It's using the SDGs and promoting a local contextualized version of the goals, but the SDGs are a key driver of what the city will be trying to achieve and what it will be measuring through 2030. So in the US, as there is globally, there's also significant leadership from the private sector that we see. I'm sure many of you know about coalitions like Business 2030, Impact 2030. We see a lot of US engagement in that, also in UN Global Compact and the SDG Compass. Our membership includes companies and corporate foundations who are working on the SDGs, both as part of their core business, but also as part of their philanthropy. And so we work closely with companies like UPS, IBM, Medtronic, Microsoft, and others, US companies that are thinking broadly about the relevance of the SDGs to their work. Sometimes they're seeing and embracing the framework as universal, we see that very much with IBM and Medtronic, for example, really putting all of their work under the framework of the SDGs, whether it's in Kenya or in Kansas City. Others are seeing the SDGs as a very key part of their global programs, but not necessarily applying it to their domestic activities. So there's definitely opportunities to expand the private sector's domestic leadership around the SDGs in the United States. And then finally, before we get to kind of what have we done with foundations and where is philanthropy engaged, there has also been leadership from domestic civil society. So as one example, there's a working group led by the U.S. nonprofit Bread for the World, which is bringing together civil society groups working on poverty and hunger to implement the SDGs domestically. And that's included work with USDA, letters to different federal agencies advocating for the SDGs, engagement around trying to brief members of Senate and the House on what the SDGs are. They also are a faith-based organization and have deep ties to churches across the United States. And so have been working with faith-based communities to have ministers and church communities who are already advocating with their legislatures or other parts of the government to also advocate for the SDGs. Similarly, there's the Food Waste Reduction Alliance, which I mentioned earlier, with Feeding America and the Rockefeller Foundation, as well as the private sector, and the Goal 16 Coalition working with Department of Justice. So there's a number of burgeoning and growing collections of civil society in the U.S. working to promote implementation of the SDGs domestically, often in partnership with both government, philanthropy, and the private sector in a number of different ways. And we see examples across the 17 goals. So philanthropy. So the Council on Foundations, we are a network of funders, grant-making institutions, and when we joined the SDG Philanthropy platform, we wanted to bring foundations together in a three-step process to think about how they can use the SDGs in their work and how they can help drive implementation of the SDGs domestically. So our three goals are: one, to educate philanthropy and raise their awareness of what the goals are; to two, help organize philanthropy to think collectively and collaboratively about achieving the SDGs; and then to three, to encourage action. And action can happen within a single foundation, within a cross-sector collaboration within a specific place, or it can happen around a specific goal, but to encourage foundations to be engaged in implementation. So far, we've had at least one convening in each of these 5 cities, and then some we've had more than one to date. And more than 250 foundations in the U.S. have become a part of this conversation about what is the relevance of the SDGs to philanthropy. I should say that our partners in this have been fantastic and critical. We aren't doing this alone. So nationally, we've worked closely with the Foundation Center, the SDG Philanthropy platform broadly, as well as the UN Foundation. And at a city or state level, we've partnered with individual foundations, as well as state or city-based networks of foundations, like the Minnesota Council of Foundations for our most recent meeting in Minneapolis. And all of those partnerships have been critical because we really see philanthropy as needing to partner and come together to achieve the SDGs. SDG Funders .org is a great source of data on how philanthropy is investing into the SDGs. So one of the things that the Foundation Center did for the site was take the SDGs and apply them for grant-making data between 2010 and 2015 to see how philanthropy was supporting the SDGs during that time. Going forward, we'll continue to track investment. So if we look at the SDG funding for the United States, this is money for programs in the United States. This doesn't include funding by U.S. philanthropy for programs in other parts of the world. Between these 5 years, there was over $100 billion of investment towards the SDGs, and we can actually see the distribution of what goals were being supported, with health and education, not surprisingly, as those are large priorities of U.S. philanthropy, being key investment areas. But there's also a number of other things, whether it be around food and hunger, or around peace and justice. There's a lot of different ways to think about how U.S. philanthropy is funding the SDGs. And philanthropy in the U.S., just for some context, is very large, both in size and in diversity. There are over 86,000 foundations in the U.S., but the average foundation of those 86,000 is very small, with less than $1 million in assets, and often one or no staff. So organized philanthropy with large staffs and billion-dollar grant-making budgets is a small percentage of that total number, but we really see potential for all types of foundations to be engaged around the SDGs, whether that be companies and corporate foundations, private and family foundations like the Ford Foundation or the Gates Foundation, or what in the U.S. we call community foundations, which are place-based. So you have the New York Community Trust, for example, a partner for our meeting in New York City, which aggregates resources from a number of different donors who care about New York and make grants locally to improve the quality of life in New York City. You see over 800 community foundations around the United States focused on local activities to build and strengthen community. And we think they're key partners in achieving the SDGs at a local level. So after our first 3 convenings, we put out a report, which you can get at that link, cof.org/SDG reports, about global goals, local impact, and how philanthropy in the United States can utilize the SDGs. And this checklist really captures what we saw and heard in our meetings with foundations. So I think number one, which I've talked about before, is the importance and possibility for collaboration. We know that philanthropy is a small drop in the bucket of the funding needed to help achieve the SDGs in the U.S. or around the world. And the real power of philanthropy can be when they leverage what they're doing to help support others. And there's a need for that collaboration and an interest from foundations to collaborate beyond just other funders, to also work with the private sector, governments, and NGOs in the U.S. There's also a need for foundations and philanthropy to think about the data. There's a lot of interest in that from foundations about how they know what their grants are supporting within the SDGs, but also foundations investing in different data monitoring tools domestically, whether it's to support the U.S. government or civil society in the U.S. to help measure achievement of the SDGs. Of course, educating and raising awareness. This is especially true with their grantees. We all know there's a power dynamic between foundations and their grantees, and often grantees engage in priorities that their funding foundations have, their funders are concerned about. So the more that philanthropy can promote the SDGs as a tool for their grantees, that will spread adoption and understanding of the framework. And we're already seeing some foundations in the U.S. start to require all grant applications and grant reports to show which part of the SDGs they will be supporting, whether that be Medtronic as a corporate foundation or the Hilton Foundation as a private foundation. Both are requiring grantees to both propose around and report on achievement of the SDGs. Of course, the sector can help track progress and needs to work with local leaders and community members to think about how we achieve the SDGs. But most importantly, I think, is this final bullet, and we've seen this over and over again in the different conversations we've hosted, the ability of philanthropy to galvanize, mobilize, and catalyze new initiatives and activities and innovations to help achieve the SDGs. And there's a real energy that can come from thinking about how even a very local initiative is linked to something much bigger and global, and to help really energize a collaboration. And that's something we've definitely seen in these conversations with funders. So what has excited U.S. philanthropy about the SDGs? You know, we started these conversations in an initial 3 cities as a pilot to really see whether this had resonance in the United States. But once we held those first 3 meetings, it became incredibly clear that there is something in the framework that philanthropy in the U.S. can resonate with and utilize. So some of the things that we've heard are excitement around how the SDGs provide us with an organizing principle, a checklist to help us organize ourselves to think about the impacts that we're trying to have. As I said before, the opportunity for collaboration to leverage resources. We have examples where in certain places you have a mix of foundations. Some are international foundations that are headquartered in that place. Others are national foundations, not headquartered there, but who have grantees in that state. And then other foundations are very local, and they work only in small parts of that state. As a funding community, that community had not found a way to think about their state and where they wanted to go collectively. So they tended to be working on the same issues, sometimes in the same geographies, within the same counties or cities, and not necessarily collaborating, not a surprise. We see that often in both development and domestic philanthropy here in the U.S. And the SDGs and conversations about the goals provided an opportunity for those different types of donors to sit together and think about their shared priorities and how they could come together to collaborate, to scale what they're doing and have more impact. There's a lot of momentum around this idea of what you're doing being larger than yourself, so think global when you're acting locally. And we often hear people say that taking time to talk about something like the SDGs encourages them to look up from their work, where they're very focused on a certain place or a certain topic, and see what others are doing on specific goals, but also thinking even globally about how other funders are working on the same issues in different contexts, which could be very powerful to inform them. That said, we have heard concerns from U.S. philanthropy about whether the SDGs are relevant. I would say there's three kind of buckets of things that we've heard. One is whether this is just another framework. There's already a lot of them. Foundations have long-term generational strategies, 10-year strategic plans, and they can't just add another thing from the UN. And so that's a challenge, but we've been able to work through that, I think, for many. Also questions of whether it's even relevant in the U.S. if the UN created it. And we talked about that already, and we really see the relevance. Also, given the size and scope of the problems we all face and the challenges outlined in the SDGs and the really ambitious targets to try and reach by 2030, isn't philanthropy just a drop in the bucket, and can they even matter? And obviously we don't think that that's true. We think philanthropy can have a very large impact far beyond the dollar amount that they can contribute. So philanthropy has a lot of benefit beyond just the funding it has. So here are a few things that we've learned about hosting these conversations. One is that we've learned to carefully consider how we frame the SDGs as a relevant domestic framework. And this has looked very differently in different locations. So in some parts of the United States, there's a concern around anti-UN sentiment as our new president cut funding to a UN agency literally yesterday. You can see this kind of anti-global, anti-UN sentiment that is present in the United States. And we don't want to fall into that conversation. So in many ways, what's been important is actually talking about the framework not as 17 goals set by the UN, but in each city we've identified 3 goals that are particularly relevant to that city and that funders are already working on. And this links to number 4 on this slide. And by entering the conversation around how do we achieve better health outcomes, ensure higher quality jobs, and improve education in our states, if that's what the event is about, then you get people in the door, and eventually you can start talking about the SDGs, and you get to the kind of these 3 goals by 2030 are part of a larger global framework of 17 goals that the U.S. helped create and has signed on to, along with 193 other countries. And so we, during our full day meetings of foundations in these cities, we really go through starting with what are the goals, but really focus on what are they locally? What do they look like? We also have learned that different foundations think about and respond differently to thinking about this framework. So corporate foundations are a great example of that. They link the SDGs across their business, not just to their foundation. And they also think about both volunteering, employee match, and grant making. Private foundations might think quite differently about it. And community foundations, it's almost always an entirely new concept. They work internationally, but at a very small amount. About 5% of their philanthropy goes outside the U.S., and the rest is very domestically focused. So they don't have the same experience of working in the past on the Millennium Development Goals, for example. So the SDGs are a very new concept for them. I think one of the biggest lessons we've learned is number 3. We don't talk about alignment. We don't say foundations need to align with the UN. Instead, we focus on how this framework reflects things that you're already working on, commitments and priorities that you've already identified for your foundation, and provide an opportunity for you to leverage your impact and take your work to scale through a multi-sector partnership. So it's not about foundations being driven by the UN, but it's about foundations bringing their particular expertise to a global framework that was really one of the most inclusive frameworks ever developed. So what's next in the U.S.? And then I would love to have questions and a conversation. We are doing a number of follow-up activities. Places like Little Rock have already had 2 convenings, so a second one to kind of drive down and figure out what they want to do collectively as a city and state. We also have more locations that are interested in hosting these conversations, so we're continuing to expand our network of both foundations and cities and states in the U.S. We also are working with the Foundation Center and others to strengthen the U.S. portal on sdgfunders.org and to think about new reports that we might put out, like the report we did last year. We also want to connect the different cities. Right now, each conversation is very local. It's hyper-local, looking at what that state or city needs. But we think there's real value in those cities being connected to each other. And so we want to find a way to do that. And we're thinking carefully about what that looks like. As I started with, there's a lot of work happening on domestic implementation of the SDGs, from whether it's business or governments or cities or nonprofits. And we want to make sure that the conversations we're having with philanthropy are linked to the conversations those other groups are having about domestic implementation. So we've joined, as the Council and the SDG Philanthropy platform, a number of national conversations with other networks to think about how we can share and exchange lessons learned and leverage our work with individual organizations and around specific issues. We are also thinking carefully about where there may be opportunities for the Trump administration to support the SDGs, but are also very open to remaining focused at the city and state level for the next 4 years, depending on where we see traction. There's also, I think, concern about drawing too much attention to something like the goals, and that maybe it's better if we just all continue doing our work and keep our heads down. But I think there's opportunity, and there are things in the goals that Trump himself has said are priorities for making America great again. And so there's questions about whether we can link some of the things he cares about, like infrastructure, improving American infrastructure, to the SDGs. And finally, I think we need to think creatively and want to find ways to link U.S. foundations to philanthropy in other countries to increase knowledge exchange. So we know that there are some other high-income countries starting to think about the SDGs, including Canada. Foundation Center and I presented at a Canadian conference for foundations last year to help introduce the SDGs to their domestic funding community. I know there is an initiative in the Netherlands that foundations are a part of, looking at domestic implementation of the SDGs. But given our proximity, we've also been in conversation with our peer networks of foundations in Mexico and are looking at ways to have cross-country exchange about the SDGs. So with that, I'd love to take questions, comments, and hear more about what's of interest to all of you.
Thank you so much, Natalie. This has been really wonderful presentation, very revealing, and we were just impressed by how much work you have done in the United States, and it's really well thought out, and you really know how to navigate this landscape. So I think, do we have questions that we... Yes, so maybe first we will respond to your questions, everyone, and Sarah will read them out, and then I have a few comments as well. Sarah.
Yeah, so we have one question from Claudio, who asks, is the new U.S. administration perceived by foundations as directly active in achieving the SDG number 1, which is no poverty, and number 7, which is affordable and clean energy? And if yes, how?
Yeah, so that's a great question, and something I was talking a bit about at the end. To be honest, we have never heard senior leadership within the administration talk about the SDGs yet. That doesn't mean they're not aware of them, but it hasn't been something that they've referred to. So we've been very focused on the career staff who worked in the Obama administration and our civil servants still working in the Trump administration. And they're throughout the administration. So you have them in different agencies, whether that be Department of Agriculture or Education or anything like that, housing and urban development. And so there is a network of civil servants who are very passionate about the SDGs and want to continue work. And so we're leaning on them as they navigate what might be possible under this new administration. We're still in the first 100 days. And some of the things that are a focus, like healthcare reform or tax reform, do not necessarily lend themselves to the SDGs. But like I said, some other commitments like wanting to invest in infrastructure could be seen as actually quite linked. So we haven't heard any explicit commitments to say that we will achieve goal X by 2030 in the United States, but there are possibilities. And so we're optimistic.
Natalie. Thank you so much, Natalie. This is very good. And we have another question about cross-country exchanges. And we have some participants from Yemen, SDGs, NGO who is working on SDGs. And the question is, how can we collaborate to leverage our level to higher professional strategic level? So essentially, the question is coming from the NGO. What would be sort of the best way to link you up with the NGOs from Yemen? Is this something that the council can do, or is this something that maybe you can do with the NGOs themselves? But the idea is to collaborate on the SDG implementation.
Yeah, so what we're seeing in the U.S. Is that I think it's very difficult for an individual nonprofit or an individual foundation to kind of invest in figuring it all out themselves because there's so much that could be done. And what we're seeing is that the best way maybe to join a network of NGOs who are working on the SDGs and connect to networks of foundations or companies also working on the SDGs. And that's where we think we can really have a larger impact instead of trying to connect or match make at an individual level. And so we are joining with other coalitions in the US. There's coalitions of domestic nonprofits, but I didn't mention there are also coalitions of international NGOs based in the U.S. who are working on the SDGs globally, led by organizations like Interaction, a DC network like ours that works with INGOs. And so we are all trying as U.S. networks to connect with each other and then to find ways to connect with non-U.S. networks as well. So that would be my suggestion, is trying to connect through a network to other networks working on the SDGs, and then through that to find, if you want to work with a specific foundation, the SDG funders.org is actually a great way to do that, because it tells you who's funding in certain countries and around certain goals. And so you can have a sense of who those funders are, and that could perhaps give you some information about who to talk to. But I do think you'll have a larger impact if you're working as a network of institutions.
Thank you very much, Natalie. This is very good. And so I have actually two questions. I'll first ask the question about cities and localizing the SDGs at the cities level. This resonates very well what we have seen at the UN, where actually the biggest group of supporters of the SDGs have actually, since the inception, have been MEDs around the world, because sustainable development just really is so relevant during today's urbanization agenda. I mean, so many cities are growing, and so many wicked and prevailing challenges are actually located in the cities. So can you tell us a little bit more, just zoom down to what essentially is that conversation in cities, beyond what you have said? Like, what are the kind of tools and approaches that you are using through the SDG lenses that have been successful, some kind of stories, or maybe lessons learned that you can tell us about localizing the SDGs at that level?
Yeah, so I think there's been a number of different approaches in the U.S. And I think what's interesting is they've they've all kind of maybe come from the same intention, but then they've looked differently. So I think that's one of the real benefits of the SDGs, is that they can be, they're very flexible and can be contextualized to what's needed for the different cities. So you have some cities where it's very much led by a mayor's office, for example. So you have a government leadership around the SDGs, and that would be like the New York example that I gave of New York City, where de Blasio as a mayor has very much led the thinking around the SDGs and what they look like locally. And he's brought together nonprofits, companies, academic institutions within the city, a number of different partners to think about what within the SDGs is most relevant, and in some ways translating a global framework for a local context. And then in other cities, like in Baltimore, you have a collection of academic institutions really leading the way about thinking around how we as a city measure success at becoming a more equitable city or a more sustainable city, and developing indicators, again, in collaboration with civil society, with some philanthropy, with a number of other actors, different city agencies, and then working with the mayor to think about how a mayor's office could adopt some of those things. And I think that's been a very different experience. And it's interesting because during the time that all of that work was happening, there was a shift in the mayor's office. There was a new mayor elected. And so actually having the leadership around the SDGs outside the mayor's office meant that it was able to bridge a new administration at a city level. And so I think there was some value in that. But it also means that as you get a new mayor, you kind of have to start over about engaging and thinking about why the SDGs are relevant and what they could mean for a city. Baltimore is also a city that went through great crisis since the SDGs have been adopted. And so in some ways, the SDG framework, again, in its localized view, has looked very different. The things that the city in Baltimore and community members have prioritized within the framework look very different than some of the things that, for example, SDSN has done in San Jose. And we saw that as well in the cities we were working in. In some cities, climate change is a key concern of philanthropy, and in other cities, it doesn't resonate at all. And so in those cities, maybe it's more about jobs or it's about economic growth. And in some places, inequality is a #1 concern of both the city or the funding community. And in other places, you know, it's not. And so what we've seen is that the success, I think, of the SDGs is when you really break it down to pull out the breadth of what is relevant and then contextualize it locally. So even though it's a global framework, it's a city framework. It's your framework as someone who lives in this city. You see yourself in it. You see your city in it. And then you're able to connect and leverage to what other cities are doing because you all are working on a shared base framework that you've then used. There's been a number of interesting things, like the Urban Institute in the US has compared existing city frameworks that American cities are already using to help think about their sustainability and what they need to do locally to the SDGs, so that cities can see how some of the things they're already working on map to the goals. And so as they transition to adding the SDGs, for example, they can see where there's already overlap of what they're already doing, and they've done that exercise. There's been a number of initiatives to try and map or to document an index of how U.S. cities are accomplishing the SDGs and global cities, all that will come out later this year. So at the city level, there's just a lot of energy in the U.S. and globally to really think about how the SDGs can be used.
Very good, and that's very useful. Thank you very much. And Natalie, we also at UNDP have a lot of emphasis at the localizing the agenda, especially in countries like Colombia. I see Maria Blanco is there today. Also in Indonesia, because these countries have a very strong also political messages that without building capacities and engaging cities and the local levels, the SDGs will not be delivered. So I think maybe we can take this conversation offline sometimes with the 3 countries and see how we can compare notes and maybe get more inspired from you, from your group. I don't know if Maria Blanca is hearing me today, but I think there is a lot of interrelated points, because I just read the big report from my colleague that went to Colombia for the SDG mission, and that language on localizing the SDGs has been very strong indeed. My next question would be around impact investing and these new forms of financing. I wonder how this relates to you and your foundations. We at the UN have this conversation a lot about the fact that, you know, we have a headache because SDGs cost about more than $4 trillion a year, a lot of money globally, out of which I think the donors can and governments can scramble for about half, but then the huge gap remains. So then there is obviously this hope that the private sector is going to come in with private investment that will also obviously yield financial returns. But the question to you is how that resonates in your conversation in the United States. Is this something that you're picking up? Are these new business models really taking off? Where, and sort of what are the key elements that you see emerging or are challenges?
Yeah, we definitely have some of our membership who are very active in thinking about impact investing and linking impact investing to the SDGs, whether that be, you know, making investments, program-related investments, or around, you know, thinking about where their endowment is invested and how that is or isn't helping to achieve their mission and how that might link to the SDGs. So one of our members is the Wallace Global Fund, and an example might be their work with the UN around energy for all and how they're trying to get foundations to think about their ability to do impact investing that increases access to energy for all, both globally but also domestically in the United States. And there's a summit about that next week in New York, and a side meeting for foundations. So I think there is a lot of interest. Impact investing itself is of a lot of interest in the U.S. We put out a report last year that looked at how U.S. foundations are both talking about and doing impact investing. It showed there's a lot of interest, but not necessarily as much action as interest, as foundations are still figuring out how exactly to do that. So within the philanthropic community, it's of course an interest, but I think it will be increasing because we're not at full capacity now. We don't have all foundations, you know, utilizing their assets that way. Outside of philanthropy, within the broader kind of financial community or investment community who sees impact and links to the SDGs, there's huge opportunity for private capital to help achieve the SDGs both domestically and globally. I'm not a part of conversations at this time, or the council isn't, with that kind of other set of impact investors, but we think, again, that's an opportunity to bridge some divides between different conversations all happening about the SDGs domestically and globally, where philanthropy should be at the table and joining that conversation. So if others are aware, we'd love to connect to those conversations and see about how philanthropy can be a partner in that.
Natalie, yes, we are actually connected with some of these conversations on impact investing and structuring these deals. That's sort of very early, but we would love to keep you in the loop moving forward.
That'd be great.
Yes, as well as on the localizing agendas and the collaboration between cities, because we do have a lot of this going on with useful tools and especially in the European level here. That's really, this agenda is getting a lot of traction, but I'm sure you're also in touch with the European Foundation Center.
Yes.
So, do we have any more questions? Yes, we do.
Yeah, hi Natalie, this is Sarah Gamsky. I'm at the Istanbul Regional Hub as well. I did have a question regarding the new administration. If you've seen any changes or developments in the direction of funds that foundations are donating, if it's an increase in healthcare or other types of initiatives, and if there's any other organizations that have emerged on the scene, whether it's an increase in faith-based organizations or NGOs that have begun donating as well.
Yeah, that's a great question. So we've convened philanthropy in a number of conversations post-election to talk about what the changes at a national level with the White House led by the Trump administration might mean for our sector, especially given now that we've seen a draft budget from the Trump administration, which cuts funding to a number of areas that are very close to the heart of foundations, whether that be the arts and culture or other types of social services and the social safety net supporting kind of lower income Americans. So there's been a lot of discussion within the sector about what this means for philanthropy. We've published a few articles and blogs about that on our website and kind of what we're hearing. I think in general, a lot of philanthropy is still, philanthropy has a long-term perspective on the problems that they're working on. And so one thing we've seen is foundations not necessarily being used to reacting and responding so quickly to changes. And the speed at which things are happening in Washington right now is incredibly fast. And so things are changing constantly. And it's unclear sometimes if it's just rhetoric or if it will actually end up being a cut in funding. So I think a lot of foundations are watching very closely, we've seen a number of foundations put up kind of funds that can be used for rapid response, or saying that in the next year they'll increase their overall grant making by a certain percentage and use that to go towards things as they develop. So trying to create opportunities for funds to be released as things change, which they think is very important. We've also seen a growth of increase in supporting media, especially kind of investigative journalism and other tools like that, given the growth of fake news and some of the things around in the election around that. So I would say that's true. In the global space, obviously the proposed budget has drastic cuts from the White House around things like USAID, the State Department, kind of U.S. investment into the UN system. If we look at the global gag rule as an example, when Trump cut funding to organizations globally that work with abortion or provide that type of healthcare to women, we did see globally a commitment to trying to fill that funding gap in some way with that, I believe it's called She Decides Fund, of which the Gates Foundation as a philanthropy was a big player in committing to that. But it's clear that if everything is cut the way it's proposed, philanthropy can never fill that gap. There just aren't enough resources. So I think at this time, we haven't seen a large-scale shift broadly of foundations pivoting either to be, to cut global funding and focus domestically, although that could happen. We haven't seen that or seen public commitments around that yet. We've seen some new commitments around certain things like investigative journalism, or family planning services globally, but we haven't necessarily seen a large-scale increase in overall funds available or things like that yet. So we actually have a conference coming up at the end of this month with our network in Dallas, Texas, and one of the things we'll be talking a lot about is where are we going as a sector and what do we see. So it should be very interesting to have that time together.
Okay. Very good, thank you. Do we have any other questions? No. So Natalie, thank you so much for this presentation today. We have recorded it and we're going to share it. This will be available on the SDG funders as well. I think this is very, very relevant to all our partners across UNDP. We will also spread the message around through our country offices as more and more countries are becoming interested in the SDG, in implementing the SDGs with philanthropy. Separately, we would like to obviously stay connected with you in the upcoming activities, and at some point, probably like in May, I would like to schedule a call with our platform to see if there are some overlapping activities that we could do together regarding, for example, work on the localization or maybe the work on the impact investing. So we would love to continue this conversation and make sure that we are all connected.
That sounds great.
Very good. Thank you everyone, all the participants, for staying with us today. This is the beginning of the series of webinars, and we welcome you, invite you to the next one, which will take place later this year on localizing the SDGs in Indonesia. So please stay tuned. Thank you very much, everyone, and see you next time.
Great, thank you.